Let's talk about the Night of the Living Dead. So, I had been wanting to watch this film for years, probably ever since I was back in high school, so at least 6 or 7 years now. Of course, it's a very iconic film, and I had seen I don't know if you'd call it parody, Shaun of the Dead, which of course is a sort of parody to Dawn of the Dead, which is the second of the three in the trilogy. But there was never a good way to find it, even though I had things like the Criterion Channel or Filmstruck when it was still a thing. I still think it was one of the most magical things to ever exist. They never had the Night of the Living Dead, and recently, when Warner Brothers and HBO were both bought by AT&T or however that deal went down, they got the Night of the Living Dead and the Day of the Dead. Now, for some reason, I don't know if it was because of some sort of copyright issue or what have you. They haven't gotten Dawn of the Dead yet, which I wanted to watch the whole trilogy, and maybe I'll come back to the trilogy when I can find the second one. And there's nothing wrong with watching it legally. I just don't like going through the work, especially when there's all of these films that I can get legally. I just don't want to go through the effort and time of finding it illegally. So for the time being, I'm going to kind of tuck that off to the side and wait until someone can find the Dawn of the Dead for me, or I can find it myself. But coming into this film, I was really excited. I had a lot of expectations coming into the film, and let me just say, I was not disappointed. Now, at only an hour and a half, it's a really short film, and it goes by really quickly. And you can see that this film was shot for a really cheap budget. And as a filmmaker who is shooting on a even lower budget than they are, it's it's always interesting to look at filmmakers who are given these tiny budgets and figure out how they did what they did and how you can sort of mimic what they do and figure out how they use so little money. And I'm of course reminded of The Evil Dead, which I suppose probably adopted some of the ideas from this, and so many other uh, independent films and first films so often are basically just shot in one house, which if you actually look at the locations for this film, there is the graveyard at the beginning, there is the house, and then there's wherever they shoot the footage for the TV. So perhaps there's a research room and another outdoor location. So there's really only about four, maybe five locations, and all of these locations could have been shot very close to each other. I mean, this could all be shot in one town. And when you have such few locations, when so much of the film takes place in this basically the one house, you have to have a lot of things going really well, and I think this film does that. I think it could have been very easy for this film to be boring. It could have very easily become a film where it's just people sitting around talking, and never at any point is that, which something that I did not expect going into the film is that the Night of the Living Dead happens almost immediately. I mean, like, I assume there's kind of some build up to it, but it's basically they go to the graveyard, and within, I don't know, 5 to 10 minutes. And again, this goes back to this idea of this film just being so quick and moving at such a fast pace. The female protagonist is attacked by the zombie, and her brother is killed immediately. And I have some problems with a lot of the female characters. A lot of them don't really do a lot in the film, especially her. I mean, the others kind of do more things, but they're often they're femme fatales, but not in your film noir way, but merely femme fatales, and like they're just kind of frozen in place, kind of fight or flight response. There's also the freeze response, of course. And the more I watched this film, the more I understood why people love this film so much. Because even though it seems to be a film merely about zombies, although they weren't called zombies in the film, they're actually called ghouls. So I think that's interesting that um, this, of course, is one of the first films that has zombies in it, and it really shaped an entire industry, if we're being honest. I mean, think of how many zombie movies there are out there and how many are influenced and inspired by this film in particular. You know, rules that they made in this film, that they have to be shot in the head, that they're slow, that they eat human flesh. These are all ideas built upon this film, which is absolutely incredible and obviously a step forward for any filmmaker, and clearly just incredibly creative. But it's also a film that has, I think, a lot to say. I think you could easily write a 30-page paper on so many themes that are in this film, and it's a real tragedy that because this film was a horror film at the time, and this is still true today. I mean, there's a reason filmmakers like Ari Aster are not recognized by, say, the Oscars or the Golden Globes. And other than the film Get Out, there really isn't a lot of play in the world of critics for horror films, which is a tragedy because not only are horror films so often just great films, they very often have a lot to say. And I would say The Night of the Living Dead has so many things to say. And then, I kind of think of the blonde woman. I don't know what her name is. I'm just going to refer to her as the blonde woman because she is the only blonde woman in the film. She is, in a certain sense, has a I'm reminded of how someone would react if they experience a sort of sexual, unwanted sexual experience, a rape of some kind. There's a lot of these kind of like nods to, being grabbed at and touched and abused and the way she reacts. And I think there's a really interesting argument to be made here that this film is actually, in a certain sense, about rape and sexual assault. And these zombies are, if you watch the film and for the first hour of the film, all of the zombies are male, and that's not coincidental. I think that's very purposeful, and there's very few female ghouls, as they call them in the film. And I certainly wonder if he was our director here was sort of suggesting a sort of dangerous patriarchal, this kind of zombie-like existence where one person does it and so we all do it, this kind of mass hysteria of sorts, and where we're ignoring the issues because, like, well, everyone does it. And along with that is, of course, the fact that it's a largely male population, and the government's not doing anything about it, and they're keeping it kind of hush hush and secret. And while it feels like a far stretch, you can see a lot of cases, especially with that in the last 10 years, not just the likes of Harvey Weinstein, but of so many, particularly men who have committed heinous acts against others, and sexual acts against others, and have committed these actions in a basically with the approval of the mass media, and also often government officials doing nothing about it. It's a real tragedy, and I think it's something this film kind of tries to deal with, and how easy it is to ignore. It reminds me a lot of the film Repulsion. Now, of course, Repulsion deals with this issue a lot more succinctly, and it's more focused on that. I think there are a lot of things in The Night of the Living Dead than just kind of this idea of this culture which perpetuates this evil patriarchy of sorts. I think it's also interesting to note that the third character that we meet in the film, and who quickly becomes the protagonist of the film, is a black man. Now, just for context, this film takes place in 1968, in the midst of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and well, actually, it's, I believe, after the death of Martin Luther King, and perhaps after the death of Malcolm X too. But these are important moments in at least American history, and he seems very aware of that, and it would be silly not to recognize that. I mean, people would throw fit if we had a black protagonist, and in fact we just did, right, with the last Star Wars trilogy. They threw a fit because our two main characters were a black man and a white woman. Well, we were doing this all the way back in 1968, and of course there are plenty of films before that, and plenty of great directors and black directors who were making films by black people, for black people, of black people. You know what I'm trying to sort of get at here is this was intentional, and he wasn't just hiring this actor because he gave a great performance, which he absolutely did, but there is, I think, a lot to do with racism, and I think this film, in a lot of ways, is about racism. I don't think it's a coincidence that at the end of the film, the one man to survive is the black man, and of course he is shot by the cops. I mean, how do you not think of so many modern instances of this thing happening right now? If you're Breonna Taylor, you're George Floyd, you're Rodney King, I mean, the list just goes on and on and on and on. Now, of course, it was less about police brutality and more about this unstoppable force that are the zombies. And I think the film could easily argue be a metaphor for racism. I mean, let's point out that every single zombie is white, and almost all of the zombies are male. And as I'm not sure if you'd call him the protagonist or not, as the black man says early in the film, they're not that strong. They can't do anything on their own. And when they find the people in the cellar, including the white man, he says, well, he flipped over a car, and the black man says, well, 5 good men can flip over a car, and he's like, the white man goes, that's exactly my point. They're not strong alone, but the power of them together, they could easily break down the doors and come in the house and kill all of us. A clear, I think at least, a reference to the power of hatred and racism, especially in the United States of America, especially in 1968. I mean, you think about just the amount of tragedies committed specifically on people who are of African American or just black in real terms, and how it's not really about the hatred of one. It's not really about the hatred of any single individual. It's about this sort of group coming together. It's about all of them coming together and fighting, or perhaps perpetuating or creating this sort of hatred. And it's no coincidence, I think, that our main, or one of the main characters, is black. And I appreciate how, even though there are so few characters and they're all taking place in the house, there's never really mention of that. There's never really recognition of that. He was just played as one of the characters, which is although today, of course, you would expect that. 1968, maybe not as much. I'm certainly glad that we got to see that, and clearly a three-dimensional character, and a character that the audience, I think, is pulling for through the whole film, and the fact that every single character but him dies is really intriguing. I remember looking at the timestamp because I was trying to figure out. I feel like there's so much, because at about an hour and 20 minutes in this hour and 30-minute film, no one was dead yet. And I'm like, how the heck are they going to wrap this film up? There's only 10 minutes left. And again, it just happened so quickly. They just kill one after the other after the other. It's interesting that it doesn't follow the trope of so many horror films, obviously mostly later, since this was still, I would say, I mean, of course there are horror films before this, your Nosferatu and the like, but I would say The Night of the Living Dead really is the beginnings of modern horror, and it doesn't really lead, come from this trope of one character dying and then another, and slowly happening throughout the film. They wait through most of the film. Like, most of the characters don't die, I guess, except for the young couple, man and woman. I know her name's Judy because they say her name like 1,000 times. I really don't know anyone else's name. And I guess they die by an hour into the film, but even then, with a film that's only an hour and a half, that's still pretty far into the film, and then all the other characters die within the last 10 minutes. And I think it's interesting that the black man shoots the white man before he's a zombie. He just shoots him as... Now, obviously, the white man's grabbing for the gun, and has this obsession with power, and there's this amazing sense of who these characters are, and I think our director had an incredible ability to create motivations for everyone, because this film could very easily, and I was afraid it was going to become a film where it's just people sitting in a house all with the obvious same motivation, and I was certainly worried because the woman gets into the house about 10 minutes in the film. I'm like, there's still an hour and 20 minutes of the film. What else is going to happen? Like, I already know that there's going to be zombies after her, and I already know all those things. So how are they going to pull an hour and 20 minutes out of this? And yet they do it quite successfully at that, and I think part of the reason it works is because every character has their own motivations beyond just getting out of the house. For, of course, the black man, it's to save the white woman, it's to create a certain leadership, it's to help as many people as possible. For the older white man, it is to just be right. There's this amazing scene where he goes back down to the cellar after kind of losing the fight, and he says, "Oh, well, they're all gonna die," and and his wife says something to the effect of, "You'd rather be right and let everyone die." And he's like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah." And it kind of points to his very specific motivations, especially in the sense that he doesn't really care about anyone's life. And although he clearly cares about his daughter's life, he think it is overwhelmed by his need to be correct. And again, it's clear that his motivation is to protect his daughter. And there's this amazing scene when him and his wife are fighting, and she says, "We might not get along with the living, but we sure as heck won't get along with the dead," or something to that effect. It's an absolutely wonderful line in a wonderful film. And then, of course, there are her motivations and the motivations of the young couple, which is, they want to see their parents again. They just want to get back home. And these conflicting motivations create for some really great tension. I mean, just that whole fight about the cellar when he first comes up is absolutely amazing. I mean, it's probably like 20 minutes of art in a very short film, of just them arguing if they should go into the cellar or not. And what's so interesting is, unlike, I would say, so many films, there isn't just a clear right and wrong answer, and you're just like, why are you not listening? It's very clear that both sides have a lot of good things to argue with, and also that they also have their own unique individual motivations, and it kind of bounces back and forth between those different motivations. And when he does end up going back down in the cellar, you can see that even though he's technically won because he's back in the cellar, he still lost because he ends up coming up with her, especially when they find that TV. And I was interested that for the first third of the film, there really is almost no technology. The the phone doesn't work. The radio only kind of works. The beginning of this film really feels like it takes place in the 40s, not the 60s. And then, of course, they find the TV. And I was really surprised by how much of this film is exposition. I would say a good 30 minutes of this film is just explaining what's going on, which is a really interesting way to do it. And that could so easily become dangerous. And I think one of the ways they do this expertly is, and I think this is part of the reason that they have the radio at the beginning, is they can play the radio, and yet while the radio is playing, you still have action going on. And it's kind of interesting, this kind of juxtaposition of sorts of the radio going on, explaining what's happening, and our black protagonist boarding up the house and doing all of these different things, and preparing the house for protection. And it creates this it not only creates conflict, but it allows it gives the viewer things that need to be shown, which is, hey, the house was boarded up, and expositional information. And both those things on their own are boring, but by putting them together, they're both interesting, which is just absolutely brilliant. And a lot of the film is explaining. If I had any complaint with this film, is there could be less explaining. They feel there's a certain need to feel like they need to explain everything, like something about for something from space coming to Earth and creating a sort of radiation, all these different things. I don't know. No, of course. To talking about this film today is a little different because we have this big trope of what a zombie is, or what they call a ghoul. So today we really don't need to establish all of these laws that we did back then. So I think that's just part of it. Just as a modern viewer, there's certain things we have as film tropes that they didn't have at the time. Certain rules and regulations that just really didn't exist at that moment. Despite that, I am really interested by the stuff on TV, and the way they explain how the zombies became zombies is actually really intriguing, and they kind of like trickle down information. And I think what's interesting about is it celebrates the reporter in a way that so many films kind of don't. And I remember listening to this ridiculous podcast recently, and the argument was that journalists are a nuisance to the world, and that they prey on other people's weaknesses, which I don't really agree with at all. But this film really seems to kind of celebrate the importance of reporters, and you'll see reporters kind of right next to these zombies and these creatures, and in these very dangerous situations, risking their lives so they can share with the world what's going on. And I love how you kind of get information, so like it's not information happening all at once. And of course, it feels a little ex machina X, right? Right when they turn on the TV, they're learning all of this important information and blah blah blah. But I love how they don't just come out and explain it. It's in many ways a mystery, and it's especially interesting because I would say about 30-ish minutes of this film is actually the TV. It's not actually them in the house. It's not actually the zombies itself. It is a mystery of sorts of what's going on, and a probe into government secrets and the CIA and the FBI and these other institutions. And I think there's certainly something to be said about politics in this film, about government, especially American government in this film, and reporters and quote unquote freedom of speech. I'm absolutely fascinated by the whole thing, and then there's just some beautiful framing in this film. I think of when they're watching the TV, you'll have them kind of standing in different places, and it creates a sense of both depth, but also it shows their importance in the film, which is absolutely fascinating. And expose on the subject of just people, I mean, the amount of extras. I know famously they had to eat like pig intestines and pig livers when they're eating the actual flesh, and it is just so gory and real. And I mean, obviously it is real intestines and livers, and oh, it makes me gag just thinking about it now. But what makes this film so incredible, and I think what makes any film so incredible, is that when I watch it today, I have the exact same amount of enjoyment I would have had if I had seen it back in 1968. It is a certain sense a timeless film. The horror is horrifying, and I have a friend who has this idea that if a film's basically before 1960, it's too boring, it's too slow, and it's true that editing has definitely quickened, and we cut so much faster and so much more often than we used to. I mean, even in films like this, I'd argue that's just the case of bad filmmaking. And with a great film, it's always going to be interesting. It's always going to be intriguing. It's always going to be worth the watch. And this film just feels so very modern in ways that so many films from 1968 don't. I mean, of course, we think of a lot of great films from the 60s. 60s is often considered one of the great eras of filmmaking. I usually call it the Renaissance of filmmaking, because while you have the golden age in the 40s and 50s, uh, the golden age is really the time of cinema where the sort of art film first began, and films could be made for much cheaper. And this is certainly an experiment in that. I mean, this film was probably shot extremely cheaply, with no big name actors and very few locations, and yet it works so well. And by 1968, of course, there have been films in color for a good 30 or so years. And yeah, I don't know if this film would work in black and white. And I'm interested to see Dawn of the Dead, because I know this film is in color and it takes place in a mall, has a lot to do with consumerism, just like this first film has a lot to do with racism and sexism and also rape culture and government officials. I also know that the second film is shot in color, which I think fits this kind of consumerist materialistic idea, but I guess I can't speak of it yet because I really haven't seen the Dawn of the Dead. I've only seen the Night of the Living Dead, but it was a very enjoyable watch. And did it live up to expectations? I don't know. I mean, if it lived up to expectations, it'd be a 10 out of 10 film, which it's not. I would say I give this film about an 8 out of 10. It's an enjoyable film, it really is, and I'm glad I have the opportunity to watch it, and I am excited to watch the rest of the trilogy. The flaws for me, honestly, one of the big flaws for me was just that it was so short. I mean, I just wanted more. I think one of the other problems is the pacing is a little strange. Everything just moves so quickly. I think that part of the problem is just a budget thing, right? Because back then, every minute of footage costs a certain amount because you're shooting on film. Where today, of course, I could shoot 10 hours of footage and it would cost practically nothing. And so I recognize that the film couldn't be longer, but I do wish the pacing was a little bit different because there's times where, they're kind of watching TV, and I wonder if those parts could be shorter and have more arguments within the groups, because it feels like there's only a couple of arguments. There's that amazing argument at the beginning with the seller, and then there's the argument about getting the gas, and then there's that amazing moment where where the white man tries to lock the black man out of the house, and he ends up getting it anyways. But despite all of those things, I just think the ending happens a little too quickly, and I'm really interested by the idea that I just think that the things that happen inside the house are so interesting that you could use a lot less of the television stuff. Honestly, I think you could have moved most of the stuff that's on television merely to on the radio, because while I think those are interesting scenes and they kind of explore this idea of how the government hides things and the importance of reporters, I think that can still be translated via radio, and I think there can be less of it. But I understand that our director here is building an entire world, and much like the first Iron Man, there's a lot more exposition than, say, the last Avengers, right? Avengers Endgame, there's a lot less exposition because we've been building on it for 10 years, maybe even longer, and yet with this is the first zombie movie, although they're not even technically called zombies, they're called ghouls. And so I recognize that a lot more exposition is there than I feel like is necessary, but I understand at the time was probably more necessary. And I would say if anything has dated, it would be that. And I also think it's interesting that the way the black man survives, and I guess he survives the zombies at least, is by going into the cellar, the very thing he refused to do through most of the film. And you have to wonder if they'd all gone in the cellar, would they have survived? And the truth is, I'm not sure, although I guess the little girl turned into a zombie, which is, I mean, you could see that coming, but I still really enjoyed it. I think it would have been more interesting if she had, like, come up the stairs and they were kind of surrounded on all sides, but I was intrigued by the idea of the woman with blonde hair, all the women were white, of course, being not only taken by her brother, but taken by this giant group of people, because if anyone's experience is closest to that of sexual assault, it was certainly her experience, and this idea of being grabbed by all of these hands, and really that is the terror of this film. It's being grabbed, it's being touched, and that's how she kind of dies is interesting, and the mother being killed by her own child is, I mean, how do you not think of it as a sort of cannibalism of motherhood, of being a mother, right? When you are holding a child, right? When you are pregnant with a child, they are literally cannibalizing your food and your body. And how do you not think about that when you see the daughter eating the mother? I mean, there is just so much to explore here, and certainly not enough in however long these podcast video episode things are. And I really enjoyed the film. I just think that the exposition is a little much, and for that alone, it sticks with 8 out of 10. But am I glad I watched the film? Absolutely. Will I watch it again? I don't know, I don't really watch movies again, but I will say to anyone out there watching or listening, if you haven't seen this film, you really should, because it is just absolutely incredible.